This video is an attempt, at least, to kind of outline some of the ways in which Microsoft 365 handles file storage. So we're going to start with OneDrive. That's the one that probably all of you have heard about. It may be best to think about OneDrive as being like a filing cabinet. Its main purpose is file storage. You can think of it as being like a personal workspace. Your PC can synchronize files from your desktop up to that cloud. And just as with a filing cabinet, you can take a file out and share it with someone else. That's not really its primary purpose. Its main purpose is to store your files for you to work on. And because it's a cloud-based service, you can do that from anywhere that you have an internet connection. The next piece that we will look at is SharePoint. SharePoint is another place in the Office in the Microsoft 365 world where you can store files. You can almost think of this as being like having both a Dropbox account and a Google Drive, in that SharePoint and OneDrive are largely separate from each other. The primary purpose of SharePoint is to share information. Any SharePoint site that you create, you can add members to, and they will then have access to everything in that SharePoint site, including a front page where you can put announcements and news stories, whatever you like, documents, and notebooks. And we're not going to go too much into the notebooks, but essentially that's a collaborative space where you have shared documents, shared things that you're working on, but where each person in the SharePoint site also has a personal space that only that person and the owner of the SharePoint site can see. If you think of OneDrive as a filing cabinet, it might be best to think about SharePoint as being like a library. In a library, there are people who control what goes into it. Not all books are in every library, but anyone who has access to the library can come in, take a book, read it, write on it if they want to, as much as that might annoy the librarians. So SharePoint is that kind of a space where you as the owner may control some of the content going in, but lots of people have access to it to read, to download, and if you choose to upload and to edit. Then we have Microsoft Teams. Teams is a collaborative space, and that is its primary purpose, is for working together on things. You do have in Microsoft Teams shared documents, and those are coming from a SharePoint site. We'll look at that in just a minute. You also have a Teams notebook, and that also is coming from SharePoint, or as I've put here, SharePoint. Apologies for that. But Teams, beyond just sharing documents and having the same features as SharePoint, it also has a chat feature, it has a video conferencing tool, and there are numerous other collaborative tools that are available to you and to the people who are on your team. So the relationship between Teams and SharePoint, you might think of SharePoint as being one of the tools that is available to a team, is access to that shared library of documents. This diagram, I hope, will help to make a little bit of sense of several of these tools. You can see OneDrive here is out on its own. It's a little bit isolated. That's because it's personal file storage, and its primary purpose is not to interact with these other things. Here we have SharePoint, and you can see there's a two-way line between SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. The reason for that is because when you create a Teams site, you automatically create a SharePoint site for that team. And if you upload a document into your Teams site, it gets moved into the SharePoint library for that site. And by the same token, if you have already created a SharePoint site and added people to it, you can create a Microsoft team based on that SharePoint site. So there's clearly a two-way street between these two tools. Reminder that with Teams, there are lines going out to all kinds of other tools because it's a collaborative app that uses those other tools. Over here we have email groups. And again, I'm not going to go into this in this video, but in Outlook, you can create a group that has its own email address, and when you create that group, a SharePoint site is automatically created for the group. So again, connection here, But you see the dotted line connection between teams and groups. Just because you create a group and a SharePoint site for it does not necessarily mean that you have a team for that group. And similarly, just because you have a team that creates a SharePoint site, that does not necessarily mean that you have an email group. You can link those two things together. That's for a later time. So let's take a look at some of these in practice. I have logged in here to my Microsoft OneDrive, and you can see that the folders look very much like the traditional Windows folder structure that we are accustomed to. I can click on my teaching folder and you can see my fall 2021 courses, my spring 2021 courses, and further folders in between. This should feel pretty familiar to you. One thing that I will point out is over here under sharing, you can see that nearly everything is listed as private. Again, this is my personal file storage space, and most of them will be that way. A couple of them are shared. These are documents that I built in OneDrive and then shared with other people. So you can share documents, you can share folders, but the default assumption is that these are private files. I will click over here to SharePoint. Again, I've logged into SharePoint. This is the main page of it. And you can see that I have SharePoint sites that I'm following. These are ones that I have starred. I've got recent ones. I've got frequent sites down here. I'm going to open up our CTL SharePoint site. And here you can see we have 3 members. Jenny Michaels is a member. Jessica O'Brien and I are owners. You'll see the difference between those in just a moment. On the left-hand side here, we have conversations, documents, the notebook that I mentioned. We can do some work with pages. This is the front page that I have done absolutely nothing with on our CTL site. I could add news, I could add quick links for the team, I can link to specific documents, and it shows recent activity. When I click on documents, you'll see a similar file structure that we saw in OneDrive, but these are all stored on SharePoint. They don't live in my OneDrive, and you can see if I click on them, same kind of folder structure. If I click here on the 3 little dots and then select Manage Access, you can see who has direct access to the document, or to the folder in this case. CTL owners, and if you remember that was Jessica O'Brien and myself, have read and write access to it. CTL visitors they can view if I were to add them, but they cannot make changes. CTL members can edit the documents. That's the extent of the permissions in SharePoint: view, edit, or own. It is possible, as in OneDrive, to share an item out with someone who is not a member of your SharePoint site. But again, the default expectation is that SharePoint is used so that members of your group can share, view, or own, depending on their permission levels, the documents that are here. So let's jump into Teams now. This is my front page of Teams. I'm going to select a simple team that I created a few weeks ago. We have a team looking at some of our course definitions. There's not much in here. When we first created the team, I uploaded a file called Common Definitions. Well, you go back to my SharePoint site, go to my SharePoint start page, and I'm going to search for course definitions. And you can see we have a course definitions SharePoint site. I did not create that site intentionally. That was created when I made the Microsoft team, but you can see there's a general folder. There's my Common Definitions document. If I were to edit it here, it would change here. If I edit it here, it changes here. That two-way street between SharePoint and Teams. I mentioned that Teams is a collaborative tool with lots of tools available to your team. And I'll show you just a few of those. We're not going to go into depth with them, but if I click the little plus here, I can add any of these tabs for my team to have immediate access to something. So I'm going to add a whiteboard. I'm going to not post to the channel. But now you can see I have a whiteboard app that has been added into my team so that if we want to collaborate, we will have a space that we can do that. And you can see everyone can edit. So you can write, "Hi, Amy." Why I would do that on the whiteboard, not entirely sure, but you've got sticky notes, you've got shapes and lines, all this kind of stuff. And that's what Teams does. It allows you to bring in all of those tools. I hope that that gives you a little bit of a better understanding of that Microsoft 365 ecosystem and the ways in which everything works together, or in the case of OneDrive, lives separate. I think one of the key concepts, though, that really helps you to start making sense of this is that OneDrive and SharePoint are two separate spaces in that ecosystem where you can store files. That OneDrive, the default assumption is that those files belong to you and you can share them if you want to. And that the default behavior in SharePoint is that they are documents that belong to a group, whether it's a group of 3 or a group of 200. Final thing that I will say, a lot of people will ask, how are we supposed to use this in our classes? And to that, I don't have a great answer, because these products were developed to make businesses more efficient. And we have taken them and we are using them in an educational environment that is not a business. And part of the challenge and the fun of these products is going to be being creative as we think through how we can use them.